Hello, everyone, and welcome to another installment of City Lights Live. I'm your host, Peter Maravellis, and as always, we are beaming to you from the unceded ancestral homelands of the Ramaytush Ohlone peoples, aka the San Francisco Bay Area. Tonight, we are delighted to have with us Dinaw Menjestu, celebrating the publication of his fourth novel, titled Someone Like Us, published by Alfred Knopf. Here at City Lights, we've been following the trajectory of his work with great enthusiasm over the years. In his latest book, with a very fine artistry, I might add, he captures the personal journey of a son of Ethiopian immigrants seeking to make sense of an obscured family history. Mr. Mengestu's gifts as a writer continue to shine through his latest work, and we're delighted to have him read us from text and also spend time talking about the experiences that inform his writing, about the diasporic communities that he so adeptly depicts, and about the craft of storytelling. So Dinaw Menjestu is the author of 3 previous novels. These include All Our Names, How to Read the Air, and The Beautiful Things That Heaven Bears. He's a freelance journalist who has reported about life in such places as Darfur, Uganda, Congo. His articles and fiction have appeared in the New York Times, the New Yorker, Harper's, and Granta, amongst others. He's a MacArthur Fellow and a recipient of the Lannan Literary Fellowship for Fiction, amongst other numerous honors. Joining him tonight in conversation, we're honored to have with us yet another great wordsmith, Eirinie Carson, member of the Writers' Grotto in San Francisco. Ms. Carson is a frequent contributor to Mother Magazine, and her work has also appeared in Electric Literature, LitHub, the Sonora Review, amongst others. She writes a regular column titled Eirinie Asks, and she's also the author of the critically acclaimed novel, The Dead Are Gods, published by Melville House. She has a forthcoming novel, Bloodfire Baby. It's going to be released in the not too distant future by Dutton Books, and she's also working on a short fiction collection. So it is with a great pleasure that we welcome now Dinaw Menjestu and conversation with Eirinie Carson. Welcome to City Lights. It is a delight to have you both with us.
Thank you so much. Yeah, very, very happy to be here.
Yeah, I am so thrilled to be here in conversation with you, Dinaw. I read your book feverishly and adored it, and would love to start this whole conversation off with a reading, if you'll permit, from your book, Someone Like Us.
Of course. And thank you so much, Eirinie, for taking the time to do this conversation, and to all of you in City Lights for hosting it. Apologies if I start coughing. I'm the start or the end of a cold, who knows these days anymore. So I thought I would read briefly from fairly early in the novel. The only thing you need to know is really the narrator of this novel, who's a former journalist, has returned home and has found that Samuel, who was a sort of father and father-like figure throughout his life, has passed away. And so he's now attending the kind of memorial service that Samuel's wife Elsa has organized for us, and he's been away from home for a while. So this is both a homecoming and also a moment of mourning for him. So the door opened behind me. Someone else was entering just as someone else was coming to say goodbye. I left Elsa in the vestibule and went in search of an empty chair tucked as far away from the entrance as possible. My mother had warned me before leaving the house not to tell anyone when I had arrived or how long I was staying. You know how people are, she said. It might seem strange that you've come back just now. No one has seen or heard from you in a long time. I kept my head down and nodded politely at anyone who tried to look me directly in the eyes. I recognized at least half the people from the last Thanksgiving meal at Samuel and Elsa's apartment that I'd attended. When I was younger, I looked forward to those large, elaborate gatherings as much, if not more so, than any other holiday. As soon as I moved to New York, though, I claimed I was too busy with school to return, and in later years, there were deadlines for stories, real or imagined, that I said made it impossible to travel even for just one day. My mother and Samuel never argued with that logic. We'd always spent at least half our days living in separate worlds. After I left home, I realized that there was no longer any obligation to reconcile them. It wasn't until a story I wrote about the murder of a Somali cab driver in New York earned me a brief appearance on a morning television show that Samuel insisted I come back to celebrate Thanksgiving with them. Now that you're famous, Mamush, he said, you have to come as the guest of honor. I promise we will even eat the turkey this year. I took the last possible train from New York to DC. By the time I arrived at Samuel and Elsa's apartment late that afternoon, there were chairs in the hallway and a second dining room table set up in the bedroom. In the years since I'd last seen Samuel twirling in his living room, Elsa had sent me pictures of her and Samuel hiking somewhere in Virginia. Hiking was apparently a part of Samuel's recovery, although neither of them would have ever used that word. He invited everyone he knows to come meet you, my mother told me. She handed me her phone so I could see what Samuel had posted online in Amharic. What does it say? I asked her. It says, famous Ethiopian journalist is coming to lecture and talk with our children. I pointed to Samuel's signature at the bottom of the post. It appeared twice, once in Amharic and again in English, with the letters doctor in front of it both times. Why did he put doctor in front of his name? My mother put the phone back into her purse. It's a joke, she said. You know how he is. That evening, with a still untouched turkey sitting in the center of the table, Samuel gave a lecture to a full house of friends and strangers, many of whom had arrived in America years after him. As he spoke of immense promise and untapped potential, of radical shifts in how we saw ourselves in America and how America saw us, I carved out 2 long lines on the bathroom counter that I hoped would be enough to get me through the evening. When we came to this country 30, 40 years ago, no one knew anything about us, he said. We were the children of suffering. We were poor, Black, hungry, but that is over now. We have homes, we have good paying jobs, we have children in universities, we are on the radio, in bookstores, and now we're on television. We're no longer on the outside. Listen to me closely. I'm telling you, any day I may even lose my accent. When he finished, there was a burst of applause. As I left the bathroom, I heard more than one person in the audience refer to him as Dr. Samuel, as in, is that him? Is that Dr. Samuel? Or, I want to introduce you to Dr. Samuel. I left late that evening to catch the last train back to New York. Over the course of the next several months, I published more stories about struggling but ultimately tenacious immigrants in America. Somalis in a post-industrial town in Maine, Darfuris in Brooklyn, a Hmong Eritrean grocery store in Minneapolis, a Nigerian Mexican Pentecostal church in rural North Carolina. I sent those stories to Samuel, who called after reading each one to say how proud he and everyone he knew was. All my friends, he said, Noah, Getachew, Mesfin, Mahalet, all of them called to tell me they read about you. Not long after that, I was promoted to writing the kind of stories likely to land me on television again. In the beginning, it was mines, mining, anything related to gold or diamonds in Central Africa. And when that faded, I switched to the long simmering border conflicts and the refugee crisis that grew out of them. There was the year of child soldiers, followed by months when it seemed like dictators were once again all the rage. Before interest in all things African bottomed out, I convinced an editor to send me to Eastern Congo to write about a former engineer turned militia leader who I described as a mix of Che Guevara meets Somali pirates. I spent the bulk of my 3 weeks in Eastern Congo at my hotel bar, the preferred meeting ground for aid workers and the militia leaders who were supposedly the source of all the troubles. The drinks at the hotel were as expensive as those at any bar in New York or London, and the bartender told me on most nights, if he wasn't careful, he could empty nearly every bottle. It's the cocaine, he said, which was cheap and all but worthless in the domestic market. Before leaving, I managed to spend several nights drinking with the militia leader I was supposedly there to write about. He spoke English rather than French and insisted that all of his friends call him Pedro and never Pierre. For our first and only interview, we drove to one of the more remote corners in the North Kivu province where the government was building a military base. As we stood near the top of the hill, a dozen feet away from newly erected gates, I asked that man why he didn't remain in the city where he was safer and where his wife and children lived. If all we did was sit around in hotels drinking, he said, people like you wouldn't be here. And if people like you weren't here, there would be no hotel to drink in. And what would happen to all the people who work there, or all the restaurants and the bars next to it? What would happen to all the soldiers from Bangladesh and Nepal and the airport the UN is building so their workers can fly direct from here to Addis? What would happen to this military base the government is building to stop people like me? You have to understand, I love my country too much not to make these troubles. Months after returning home from that trip, I'd yet to write a single word and was rarely sober long enough to even try. Samuel suspected something was wrong. When I failed to answer his messages, he persisted with sometimes daily calls reminding me that Elsa and my mother were worried. By the time I finally answered his phone calls, I'd blown multiple deadlines and whatever career I'd assembled was in a rapid state of decline. What's happening to you, Mamush? Samuel asked, even though I suspected he knew already. I told him about the missed deadlines, the stress and exhaustion that came with travel, about the engineer turned militia leader. He offered what he thought was the only solution to my problems. Come home, he said. You can stay with me and Elsa like you used to. You can work from here. There's so many beautiful things you could write about. Not everything you write has to be about suffering. What would happen if someone like you wanted to write a comedy or a love story? Something people want to read. Then someone like me could write a comedy or a love story. I told him they would just have to make sure there's a little suffering or no one will believe it. How much? It depends on many things. The country you're writing about, time period. How long, Mamush, until you can write a happy love story with only a little suffering? 5, 10 years? I'm not sure, I told him. I would say much longer. We ended the conversation with me promising to call my mother at least once a week. The next day, Samuel arrived unannounced at my apartment in Brooklyn, a basement studio whose lack of light had been an unexpected source of comfort on the nights I didn't sleep. As soon as he entered, he began to throw away the most obvious signs of neglect. He emptied ashtrays into the garbage while pointing out that in the diaspora, just like in Ethiopia, there are no high school dropouts or failing children, no depression or mental illness, no drug addicts or alcoholics. The only problems we have, Mamush, are a loss of faith and culture and maybe having too many American friends. That's it. If your wife is having an affair with another woman, you tell your friend she's given up on God. And if your child is arrested for dealing drugs, you tell your family he has lost his culture. If he is doing drugs and he has lost his culture and has too many American friends. Now, Mamush, tell me, how often do you go to church? How many American friends do you have? There were 2 empty bottles of bourbon on the coffee table along with multiple lighters and a razor blade. What do you think? I told him. I think you have to take care of yourself, he said. There are many people who look up to you. People ask me, what happened to him? When is he going to write something? You're like a son to me, you know that? Whatever happens to you happens to me. Do you understand that? At the time, I didn't. Exactly, I said. I'm like a son to you. It's close, but not the same thing. And what is the difference? Permanence. Today, you're like a father to me, but maybe tomorrow you're like a distant cousin I've only met twice. Similes can change. They can be revised, edited. Exactly. And do you know what that means? It means I have to work very hard to keep you close to me. I fell asleep on the couch not long after that. By the time I woke, Samuel had cleaned the apartment of every empty bottle and lighter. As he prepared to leave, he asked me what had happened to the book on migration I told him and my mother about. Do you remember, Mamush? We used to talk about it all the time. I was 18 when I described wanting to write a book that would cover the history of human migration from Ethiopia to the present. A collection of dozens, perhaps even hundreds of individual stories of people leaving their homes and creating new ones, not just in America, but all over the world. That isn't true, I said. I talked about it once. That doesn't matter. It was a good idea. Why don't you write that book now? Go to Ethiopia and write it. It doesn't work that way, I told him. Why do you say that, Mamush? Of course it does. I will help you write it. I'll take you to the Afar region in Ethiopia and you can see how they live. You can walk with them, and then after, if you want, you can throw your passport and go to Europe and America, pretend like you're a refugee. My mother called a few days later after that to tell me how surprised she was to learn that Samuel had been to New York. She'd claimed he'd made the trip without telling her. He said, your apartment was very dirty, like a typical American, but it's because you're busy working on a book. I asked him what it was about, but he wouldn't tell me. He said he was going to help you write it. Samuel and I discussed our imaginary book project only once after that, years later, when I returned from Paris to visit. We had just entered the house he and Elsa had recently moved into when Samuel began to poke at the weight I'd put on since moving to Paris. He was skinnier then than I remembered, and I was almost certain that at least once I noticed a slight tremor in his hand while he was sitting still. Your mother wants me to ask you how our book is coming along, he said. Are you writing? By which he meant, are you taking care of yourself? Have you learned to live with whatever it was that was destroying you? I told him yes, I was, without ever asking if the same was true for him. I will stop there.
Thank you so much. It was a really beautiful passage to share, and I feel like it tacks into my first question really nicely. As the book starts, we know that the protagonist, Mamush, his father figure is dead, and we know opaquely little of how that might have happened. Substance use is hinted at. And we know that Mamush is also struggling, as we heard in that passage. It reminds me of the notion that as we deal with the ghosts of the past, unless we deal with the ghosts of the past, we are kind of doomed to follow in their footsteps. And I wondered if that's something that you feel yourself as a father, and if that's what you're doing when you write, working through the ghosts to get to some other side.
Yeah, that's a lovely question. I think sometimes I don't know if we can always reconcile our relationship with the past. But I think we have to converse with it, right? And I think there's a kind of a set of ongoing conversations that are kind of necessary. I think sometimes it's easy to imagine that, well, if we can look at the past carefully or honestly, and we look at it in the proper light, that doing so will sort of ease or put away some of the kind of the burdens or the tensions that come with it. But I tend to think of the past as kind of like as far more kind of alive, and that even that idea of the past as a ghost, right? It's like it's not settled, right? Like something is a ghost because it continues to kind of haunt, right? Continues to sort of reside. And I think I'm and the characters in this book are certainly more conscious about living with those ghosts, right? Like they are very much present, and not only how do you live with them, but how do you actually like communicate and talk with the memory and the legacy that people leave behind, and what's the kind of like responsibility we have to those. So there's with the narrator and Samuel, they're both very close, and yet at the same time, it's almost like in death do they get to actually kind of have the conversations that they wish they could have had. And shortly after that passage, there's kind of extended scenes where the narrator is kind of imagining conversations with Samuel's ghost, and he knows obviously he's not there. But also he also knows him well enough where the conversations kind of feel real, right? They're both a reflection of the narrator, as much as they are a reflection of Samuel, as much as they are also a reflection of their relationship together. So, but it's not just one conversation, right? It's like a series of it's like an ongoing dialogue that they need to have. And they're both really interested in stories, right? And they're both really interested in the way stories not only are told but are kind of retold, and the kind of even the need to keep them alive, right? We also we tell the ghost stories partly because we want them to be alive, right? We want them to be with us. There's both for the good and the bad. Some things we kind of wish to keep away, but we also want to hold those traumatic parts. Sometimes we want to hold those traumatic parts close to us.
Yeah, I definitely recognize a lot of like my own, as someone who has lost people, my own grieving in how Mamush has this dialogue with Samuel. I think it's just there's an accessibility with the life of someone who is dead that you don't get when they're alive, because there's no boundaries anymore. There's no walls put up. There's
Yeah.
no sentences to pass through and kind of read between the lines of. I think you're really dexterous at writing these conversations, and it kind of speaks to this palimpsest of time that you go throughout this book. There are multiple timelines happening, and we kind of are flitting between timelines. And I wondered if that was hard for you to write. How do you, as a writer, keep that craft, that structure?
Yeah, sometimes it's like, how's it for the reader? Hopefully my hope is that these characters are that they're that they're alive and that they're layered and they're complicated, but that also within that idea of the sort of complicated character, there's also a sense of like, for me, sometimes the most fully complicated characters, also the ones that reside slightly beyond our understanding, right? There's Flannery O'Connor has this wonderful argument about the idea of mystery in characters, and the argument that really what makes a character alive is getting them to a point at which we don't understand why they do what they do, because that's kind of human part of our existence, is the fact that we are mysterious and irrational and illogical creatures, and not everything we do can be explained, and not we can't explain away why we believe the things we believe, and so to try to create characters in which we can always understand their motivations by parceling out what happened in a series of events isn't always a reflection of like who and how we actually live. We're far more weird, and we're far more bizarre, and we're far more interesting, I think, oftentimes than that. And so I was very interested in the kind of construction of characters who could retain kind of both that sense of mystery and a kind of opacity. And one way they could do that was also through the way we move through time with them, right? Like that we are understanding them as products of like multiple moments in their lives. And in order to do that, you're moving through a present moment, but of course, as you're moving through a present moment, you're constantly encountering pieces from the past. And if you assemble them all together, you don't get like a kind of, here's a rational explanation for why this character is doing, but you get, like you said, a kind of a palimpsest. You get a series of kind of like images that take you to different parts of an individual's life. And through the collection of those things, hopefully you get a sense of who they are and why they might be doing some of what they're doing. But they also, like I wanted this sort of interesting kind of fluidity, right? Both between time, but also reality. There's moments in which like the narrator starts the story in one place, and then he's also very clearly connecting it to another memory, which connects you to another place. And in a similar way, the characters are constantly telling you stories that about who they are, and sometimes those stories aren't real, and sometimes they are. Sometimes they're having a conversation that's completely invented, and sometimes it's true. So I kind of loved all the possibilities that I realized I can kind of get away with, right? That you can create time travel in a novel without having a time machine. You can just allow the character to kind of like be in a space and remember something, and then allow that memory to take them to someplace else, and then still find your way back to where you were at the beginning of that sentence. And if you did that, at least
I mean, I definitely I finished the book and I kind of set it down and took a moment, and I definitely had the urge to like start all over again, because I feel like, I mean, I think that's what we do with our grief often with our dead. We hold them up to the light and try and figure out the answer.
Yeah.
And I think you say somewhere towards the end that, oh my gosh, I wish I could remember I have so many notes. Please excuse me. You say somewhere towards the end that you can't have an answer, something like that. Let me find. You know what? We're going to circle back to this point because it's very sage and very wise, and you will all be dazzled by my question, but I need to find it first. We're going to circle back. I do want to talk about the title of your book, Someone Like Us. You know, we meet him. He's kind of, Mamush is writing these kind of almost kind of classic stories about immigrant life that fit into a sort of stereotype about what it means to be an immigrant in America. And Sam is chastised by Samuel, and he's writing about it from a distance, because his experience as a first generation American is not the same as that of his mother or Samuel's as immigrants. And that's what Someone Like Us spoke to for me. And I wondered what it means to you.
Yeah. I mean, it means lots of things. I think, I mean, some of it, you know, you sort of know is, you know, for me, I think wanting to be kind of deeply skeptical about my relationship to how I've told these kinds of stories in the past, and wanting to be, and to some degree, kind of like taking a critical kind of like gaze back and thinking about what it means to sort of write and narrate stories that are, you know, sometimes closely rooted, but nonetheless sort of different. And what are the ethics of that kind of narration, right? How do you do and how do you talk about these stories in a way that doesn't kind of totalize the meaning of them? And you know, and one thing I kept thinking about was like, how do you know, I'm always sort of slightly frustrated when somebody, you know, if they read it and they say, oh, now I feel like I understand the Ethiopian American experience. And I always feel like, well, that's not what I don't want to do that, because that makes it feel like you've now read an experience and you can then go on and do something else. Because what you've done is you've dipped your toe into like the pot of, you know, that community's experience, and you've gone to the restaurant and you've tasted the food and you're great. Like, now I know it. And you know, and that's it's like an interesting idea, and I understand why people can sometimes feel that way, but I also don't. But I also feel like there's a way in which perhaps the narrative can push and ask for more from both the reader and myself, which is to try not to give you, just try to question and even interrogate the idea that you're going to read this and have that experience. Because what I guess what I'm trying hopefully to avoid is allowing myself or the reader or the characters to feel like they represent an experience that can be defining of a community, because that then begins to kind of solidify that community in narrative form in a way that's really problematic, right? Because then they begin to become tropes. And
yeah, a monolith. Yeah.
yeah, and there's, you know, and so you think, well, what do I do to let that not be the case? And one idea, you know, that I was sort of heavily influenced from Susan Sontag's, was to think about the idea of the like, and to think of the idea of, rather than, you know, one response to the idea of the monolith, or one idea to the sort of totality of a narrative or an image, is to offer the like, and to say through repetition something like this, right? So she talks about you know, representations of war, and rather than an image that tries to capture one version of what happened, to come up with 13 representations of it like Goya does, and say something like this happened. And you have to then encounter that image multiple times, and every time it's slightly different, but that means you're forced to engage in a slightly deeper way as the viewer or as the reader. You don't get to just look once and walk away. You kind of have to look again and again. And with each encounter, something different is revealed, not only about the image, but also about your relationship to that image. So I liked that idea a lot. And I liked the idea of trying to create a narrative in which there was no certainty as to what we were kind of like really looking at, you know, that Samuel and Mamush are both sort of there, but they're also slightly opaque. And there's in particular, I'll read the quote from Sontag. This comes from the book Regarding the Pain of Others. And she writes, for the other, even when not an enemy, is regarded only as someone to be seen, not someone like us who also sees. And alongside of that was that question of like, well, how do I also give these characters the capacity to engage with their own narrative, right? To actually look back in a certain way and to kind of criticize and critique the very story-making project that they are kind of, a part of. And so throughout the book, they talk a lot about stories. They talk a lot about how their stories, and Samuel's very conscious about how his story is told, about wanting control and agency over his own narrative. And for me, that was a way for them to actually kind of see back, as much as that might be possible in the narrative, was to like introduce the problem of looking at a character as if the character can't look back at us, and to try to figure out, how do I implicate, myself as the author, right? Like there's, from the part I just read, there's a kind of critique very much of my own position and the things I've written before. And I wanted that to be a part of the text. Like I wanted the problem of telling this story, of writing these stories, to be not something that I just assumed I had the right to do, but something that actually, you're trying to kind of wrestle with, and the characters themselves are talking and sometimes critiquing, and in some cases, mocking, someone like me.
Yeah, that makes me think of, I don't want to do spoilers, but there are some conversations between Samuel and Mamush that kind of exist in this almost stepping out of telling the story about Samuel's life.
Yeah.
That I think speak to a little of that, being able to see the other fully.
Yeah.
When you talk about your ancestry, you've described your dual heritage as hybrid, people with dual heritage as hybrid complex characters made out of both places. Do you think that Mamush feels this way? Is this why he floats between things and is kind of unable to land throughout?
Yeah. You know what? There's a moment in the novel where one of the characters says to the narrator that he's like he's like a donut. There's a hole somewhere in where something solid should be. And there's, there's a certain kind of truth to that, but also not. And I kept thinking about the idea, and this is really in these sort of conversations about what it means, to have these sort of multiple identities in places that shape our identities, and that are, can lead to this feeling of being not kind of singular. And I guess what I have been thinking about more with these characters in particular is that that the sort of multiplicity of their identity is reflected most in the fact that the way they write and the way they tell stories, right? Like for them, that where they exist to some degree is in narrative. Like they exist and they remake themselves kind of over and over through the stories that they are constantly telling and sharing and creating and fabricating and making up, and also just expressing and passing on. That space is actually it's not just a practice, but it's also in and of itself the kind of identity that these characters are sort of formed out of. Like they're formed out of both these multiple heritages, but also the need to make something out of them, right? Like it's not, you can passively receive these sort of dual identities, being, having a connection to Ethiopia and but also being very deeply rooted in America. But what makes it more, I think, kind of interesting is that they're constantly toggling back and forth between them, right? And so like where they're most at home and where their identities perhaps most fully shaped is in the kind of like making of narrative, right? Like in the act of actually constantly constructing and using language and telling themselves this is who I am now, but it might not be that tomorrow, you know?
I suppose with Samuel and Mamush's mother, when you are an immigrant, when you are moving from place to place, there is this opportunity to kind of decide what the story is that you will tell in each place. And I think we kind of catch glimpses of this person, of these people living in the in-between of their stories, of their lives in Ethiopia, their life in Italy, their lives in Chicago. And it's a really beautiful way of kind of fleshing out someone, and also speaking to this, what you mentioned before, this notion that we can't a character doesn't feel real until they are kind of, we're not really sure where the truth lies and what their motivations are. I wanted to speak a little bit about Christopher T. Williams, who is the alias that Mamush uses in college to write a kind of black paper, because everything that he'd submitted before wasn't wasn't really speaking to the white professor. Do you ever feel pressure as a writer to write about very specific aspects of blackness that might be titillating to certain audiences? And what advice do you have for Black authors who are on how one steps away from any desire to be Christopher T. Williams?
Yeah, no, I mean, you know, and in that case, it's I don't know if I feel, because also I don't think that there's enough there's enough there's enough room for, you know, the kind of diversity of literature that actually is, and the diversity of storytelling that's actually out there. I think we're also slightly conscious of, and or at least I certainly am, that, you know, that you worry that there's only like so much room for these kinds of stories. And so the question isn't like, do you feel pressured to do that? But the question is like, you know, do you still dare to do that? Because it's very easy to imagine that someone's going to be like, well, we already did that, or there was something like that, and that already happened. So probably don't need another one for a couple months or maybe a couple of years, because, you know, our market can only hold X number of you know, of experiences like this, even as we also expect those experiences to kind of perform and look a certain way. And so, you know, in the construction of that identity, it was very much the, you know, Mamush being aware that there was a kind of like convention out there that was the one that was, you know, to some degree laid out, but it was also the one that, you know, that in a certain way that he kind of also longs for, right? There's a kind of because there's a familiarity and a safety inside of that, right? And it's almost like, well, if I could just absorb this kind of like, you know, monolith or singularity of an American identity, then I could do all these things that, you know, would be more comfortable and familiar for, to some degree, an audience, right? They would know like, oh, well, this is what I did after school, and these are the kinds of things that like, and that would all feel, the familiarity would feel welcome in a certain way, right? It would feel welcome for the reader on the other end of it, and it would probably feel somewhat soothing for him, because he would have to, you could stop trying so hard to explain that the story you're asking me to tell isn't possible, because it's not the life that I lived, or it's not, doesn't reflect my own reality. And it gets exhausting trying to kind of make that argument. So wouldn't it be nice, instead of having to try to say, well, no, my life actually wasn't like that, it was like this, it'd be nice just to be like, oh yeah, actually, yeah, that's what it was, you know, and that's what I did, and this is who I am. So yeah, there's you know, it comes from both a kind of like frustration, but also like a sense that like, oh yeah, like Christopher T. Williams, yeah, and there's a kind of power, right, with that. Like he makes that fake identity, and you know what he uses with that fake identity for is actually just kind of like walk around and tell people that's who he is. It's like, here's a name that's like familiar and that is known, and that an identity that feels kind of stable. And wouldn't that be nice?
Yeah, an easy mask to slip on for sure.
Yeah.
Um, okay. Um, the America that you show us in this book might be unrecognizable to some, but to many of us, it's really familiar. Um, I want to believe in Samuel's imagined cab company and the promise that it holds. And I feel like you portray the dead ends of life as being poor and black in America, um, and the ways in which you can be thwarted by poverty and racism. Um, but it never felt like sensational, and it was very kind of everyday, and maybe that's where the horror lies in the kind of the roteness of it. Um, I wonder if you can share where your hope lies um, for this is a big old ask for Black immigrants and their children in America. What does that feel like to you?
Um, I mean, I think the hope sometimes, I mean, at least for me, comes, um, I mean, slightly perhaps with the kind of transparency, right? There's, at least the way I sort of grew up, there was such a desire to kind of like put on a sort of veneer that everything was sort of okay, that it masks a kind of a sort of ordinary challenge, like like a lot of what sort of undermines Samuel, to some degree, it's not even necessarily like these sort of dramatic events. It's like watching himself be kind of pulled apart by parking tickets, right? And watching the accumulation of debt that sort of begins to kind of pull away his ability to kind of you know, like make it in the world, because he's constantly falling one step behind because he's trying to do X and then this thing happens and he gets a ticket and then that leads to another. So there's all these ways in which he has these sort of ambitions and these desires, and those desires are constantly met with these unexpected and also seemingly minor, but the accumulated pressure is quite significant and quite profound on him. But what there isn't, for oftentimes is because there is a lot of, I think like, there's a lot of hope, certainly, right? Like, the next generations, especially with, migrant African communities tend to do fairly well. I mean, they do exceptionally well, in fact. But I guess I'm trying to measure it not in the material gain, right? Like not in the, the accumulation of it's great to of wealth or resources, but rather like a kind of transparency of experiences, right? And a willingness to be able to kind of share not only what came before, but also like what it took to get here. Which I think oftentimes we do, at least, I know in my own community, we try not to talk about so much. We I don't when in writing the book, I kept thinking one of the things that actually does happen in migration is there's a kind of a vocabulary becomes possible that wasn't necessarily possible prior to that, right? Like,
Mm,
when that sort of discourse there where, Samuel's like, well, in Ethiopia, we would never say these things, right? Like we wouldn't actually, there's no vocabulary for,
yeah,
addiction and grief and depression. We would just say, we would attribute it to other things. And a part of me is like, well, if we are, we're here now, so let's use that vocabulary, right? Let's actually like make and participate in these terms and in this discourse, which we would have been harder to do had we not been. So yeah, I mean, I
yeah,
do find there's something really vital to that, and probably really significant for the generations that come.
yeah. It's moving the needle a little bit. So
Yeah.
kind of yeah, the understanding, I suppose, like with each, it's like having. I mean, it's like being a parent. You get a little bit better than the ones before you, and it
Yeah.
keeps going and it keeps going. Um, I think that this book does a really beautiful job of illuminating this kind of the complexities, the pitfalls, the the everydayness of being an immigrant in America. Um, So I remembered my part from your book. You're right. The worst thing you can do is leave people without an answer, which I thought was a little tongue in cheek, because we there are so many ways during this book that we never get the full kind of jigsaw comes together and the picture is there, and that is where the beauty lies. I think this fragmented, complex portrait of a family. And so I feel like I also won't leave us with an answer here tonight. And yeah, I wanted to talk about actually the inclusion of photographs in this book, and what your choice was behind that. And is it your wife, the photographer, who took those photos in a kind of beautiful fiction mirroring life, vice versa?
Yeah, they're I mean, some of the photographs come partly because of this kind of conversation with Sontag's essays on photography, which were kind of very important to how I think I was originally thinking of the book. And you know, in the narrator and the book is actually be very clear, like the book deviates very dramatically from my life. There are certain things, anchors that I use oftentimes, both in this book and other books. And the narrator's wife in the novel is a photographer, and my wife is as well. But what made it interesting for me though was one, the images, you know, the two of them in the novel, they talk about, to some degree, like they like the idea of being able to talk without language. And there's a way of communicating in gestures and in images that they really like, because it allows for multiple meanings, and it moves away from the idea of a kind of like the fixed, sometimes the very kind of stickiness of an actual word or an actual term, but that they can say sometimes more by expressing you know, a gesture, or by pointing to an image. And so I wanted that to be part of it. And also because sometimes, you know, in all the ways in which like things are sort of moving fluidly, there's a kind of anchoring that can happen with the photographs, right? The photographs fix things in a certain place and time, but they don't necessarily fix they don't fix the meaning. So even though the photographs are very much constructed, there's also a continuing kind of like ambiguity about how and what they can do. So I like that. I like the fact that the photographs are like they're some of them are, you know, well, almost all the photos were deliberately constructed for the book. So you know, there'd be a passage where the narrator would just say something, and then he would talk about his wife taking a photograph and sending him an image, and then, you know, my wife would make an image that would go along with it. But I also really liked the idea too of having another narrative presence in the novel that was kind of out of the narrator's control and my control as the author. So the wife is she communicates to some degree in a very independent way, in a way that like I don't control, because I didn't make the photographs. I really left her to do that. And so there's a kind of extra consciousness in the text that isn't that's out of the narrator's control. It's like she gets to kind of be present and say and make her own experience as sort of palpable in the text in a way that he can't do anything to mitigate, and that I, as the author, couldn't do anything to mitigate, really. So I like that. I like the idea of her presence being more than just like, you know, she said this or she thought that, but actually being like, there it is, right? There's a consciousness in the text that's not mine, and an aesthetic that's also not mine.
That's really interesting. Thank you.
So Bill asked the question, can you talk about the unique challenges of writing about people who have survived trauma, especially asylum seekers?
Yeah, I mean, I think a large part of it is to make sure that you're you know, and it goes back to what sort of the earlier part too about wanting to make sure that you don't kind of totalize the meaning of someone's life, right? And so that means making sure that they are not just a reflection of their most difficult experiences, that they're not only the trauma, that you might not even get access to the trauma, that is something that they might have lived and seen or experienced, but by no means does the narrative actually obliged to share that with you, or is that person too? And so that earlier conversation we were having as well about a kind of opacity is kind of really important with these characters as well. At one point in time, I think Samuel says to the narrator about his mother, like, she had a life and you won't know about that, and you have to respect that. And so you don't expect to know what happened, or don't think you have the right to also know, or don't think that if you did know, you would know the person. It would just be, one part of who they are. So I think to some degree, for me, there was a lot of a real desire to want to respect that right to not tell, to not say, to not only to not reduce the characters to that, but to also allow them to not have to explain what it is that might have happened to them. But doesn't mean you don't get to know them, right? It just means you get to know all these other parts that kind of surround them, and you get a sense of them and you have an understanding of them. But like the people very, very well in your life, like, you don't know them, their trauma, unless you've spent a long time with them. So I think I didn't want this narrative and sometimes even when it does, there are real questions about the veracity of what the characters are telling you about what may or may not have happened to them. So yeah, for me, that was like the kind of like the most ethical way I had of trying to treat that idea.
I Elsa at one point says something like, you need to hear, I'm paraphrasing, you need to hear what I'm saying, what I'm not saying.
Yeah.
And I felt like that was such a key for me for the whole book, that kind of unlocked something for me. And I feel like it shifted a focus in the book in a really beautiful way, and understanding these complex stories full of trauma differently.
I'm curious to know what some of the challenges might have been with you and your editor in working through this particular novel.
I think I have to say, I think I mean, my editor she was very generous, and there was a kind of like, can you sometimes tell us more? Right? There was and certain things that are certainly more clear now in the earlier versions were even a little bit more opaque, and I had to the relationship, for example, between the narrator, Mamush and Samuel, was as intimate as it is now, but the actual kind of like filial relationship and the nature of that was kind of kept really muted, if not entirely off the stage. And and there are questions like, can we get a little bit more permission to go into that, because it'll help us understand. And and I did agree with some of those. It helped me certainly push the characters a little bit forward, so that way the reader could sometimes just know, like, yeah, like, part of what's here is also a father-son relationship. But I'd say, like, I thought my editor would be a little bit more concerned about the kind of fluidity of time, and the way but and to some degree the kind of like imagining that's so central to the characters. But she really believed in that part of the way the story is told. And so but it took so long to write, in part because I all of these pieces needed to be to come together, right? Like, if you're going to move from in and out of time, then you also need to make sure that when you do come out at the other end, that the reader should know where they are, and that the reason why you went back was really legitimate, right? Like, there needed to be a reason for the story not to just be linear, and like and hopefully that's palpable.
How long did it take you to write the book?
So 10 years, this one. Yeah. I don't know why it took so long. But
so sometimes it goes like that.
Yeah, there was small children at the time too. I had to wait till they. It was easier when they got older.
So, Eirinie, we have time for maybe one more question if you like. And
Sure.
yeah.
There's one question
There
in
was,
the
yeah, I was just gonna
Oh,
bring that
yeah.
now.
Janice asks, what did you develop first?
I guess in terms of, I mean, I could say, you know, what the story began first with the uncertainty around what happened with this Samuel's death. I mean, I knew the story was like starting off with, you know, the narrator coming home and finding that Samuel had passed away. But in the early version, we sort of knew why. But then once I took out that, we knew how, we didn't know why. And then once I took out even the how and then the why, then it became something else. But then the story didn't stay there. It didn't stay with just, you know, why did this happen to Samuel? But also then it became also about the relationship between Samuel and the narrator, and then the narrator's relationship to his own wife and to his son. And so it kind of kept metastasizing in ways that I hadn't always expected, but it needed to also always find its way back to Samuel, because that's where the story began.
Thank you. I can do one final question, Peter, if you think we've got the time.
Yeah, sure.
Great. As an author myself, I often have a sense of kind of delving into my own self when writing about, specifically when writing about my ancestry and kind of passing through that. I'm also the daughter of an immigrant. Did you unearth anything from your own history as you wrote this book?
For my own family's history,
Your own, yeah, your own history, your own ancestry. Was there anything you learned about Dinaw's story?
Yeah, I'm sure. I'm not sure if how much you're willing to say. Yeah. Well, because, you know, the story certainly took me, you know, it took me back to like places in my life that I hadn't thought of in a really long time. And so certainly, yeah, like it allowed me to go, you know, like the novel moves in different parts of the country and parts of the world. But parts of the novel go back to Chicago, which is also where I spent a part of my childhood. And even though it's a very different version of Chicago than I'd grown up or lived in, it gave me a chance to sort of certainly to see the city, and you know, and in particular Chicago during that, you know, late 80s, early 90s, and to think about its politics, it's certainly like it's sort of the strong lines of like discrimination that existed in the city, in an interesting way that, and to think about the way those things that seem so far away actually continue to kind of reside in you, because there they are kind of like working their way back out in fiction, you know, 20 years later, or 30 years, 40 years later, in fact. So yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, I wondered about, I know that it's fiction, and I know that it is a reader's tendency to decide that any fiction that is similar to the author's lived experiences is, you know, auto fiction. But I was curious about how that connected to your life. I love that your wife got to be kind of almost bring a voice to this wife in the book also.
Yeah, that was really special for us.
And you said that you gave her the kind of notes of what you were imagining, or had she read the manuscript when she began making it, or did you give her as little as possible?
I would only give her the page on which the photograph would be mentioned, but what she could do with that, I never said. It was like, here's you know, we began to do it before the novel was finished. So about like 3/4 of the way through it, when I realized I wanted the photographs, first I took a photo that I knew she had already done, and I tried that, and I was like, oh, actually, now I'm just stealing from you, and that's not fair. So I usually decide if you want to give me the photograph, and or if you want to, like, you know, if you really want to do it, then maybe you want to even make the photos to go alongside of it, and she was very much game for that.
Great.
That's such a beautiful process.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, we're at the top of the hour, and this has been such a great pleasure. Dinaw Menjestu, congratulations on yet another very, very fine, very compelling work. Eirinie Carson, thank you for doing the honors. Such a great interviewer, and so great to have you back again. And we actually look forward to hosting you too for the next books.
Yay, thank you.
And thanks to all of you in the audience for joining us tonight. Very grateful. Once again, I want to remind you, we posted links with which you may purchase books in the chat. Or better yet, if you find yourselves in the hood, drop on by, browse our shelves. We're one of the great browsing experiences of the West Coast. We're located in San Francisco's historic North Beach district, at the corner of Columbus and Broadway. We're open from 10 a.m. to 10 p.m., getting back to our pre-pandemic hours. We would love to see you. Tonight's event has been made possible by support from the City Lights Foundation, continuing the legacy of our founder, the poet, artist, and publisher, Lawrence Ferlinghetti. Thanks for joining us, everyone. Be safe, be well, be kind to each other. We hope to see you all again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Eirinie. It was such a pleasure to be in
Thank
conversation.
you, Dinaw. It was a treat. It was a real treat. I really loved it.
And thank you all for coming. Have a wonderful evening, everyone.